All right, so thank you all and welcome to the next installment of the By the Book series. We are excited to celebrate the publication of Shoddy, From Devil's Dust to the Renaissance of Rags by Hanna Rose Shell. We're looking forward to what is sure to be a really fascinating conversation about the book between Hanna and Emily. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone to please keep their mics muted to limit background noise during the talk. And if you don't mind, please put your questions in the chat and we'll try to moderate those in the latter portion of the program. I want to give a special thanks to our partners in the By the Book series, Chicago's own Seminary Co-op bookstore. I'll share a link to Buy the Book in the chat here in a minute, so you can go direct to the co-op. They'll send it to you anywhere you would like. And I just want to give a quick introduction to our speakers, and then I'll turn it over to Hanna and Emily. Hanna Rose Shell is Associate Professor in the Department of Art and Art History and the Department of Cinema Studies and Moving Image Arts, and she's Faculty Affiliate in the Department of History at the University of Colorado Boulder. In addition to Shoddy, she is also the author of Hide and Seek, Camouflage Photography, and the Media of Reconnaissance. Emily Cockayne is a senior lecturer in early modern history at the University of East Anglia. Her most recent book is RUMMAGE, A History of the Things We Have Reused, Recycled, and Refused to Let Go, which was just published this July by Profile Books in the UK. She is also the author of Hubbub, Filth, Noise, and Stench in England, and Cheek by Jowl, A History of Neighbors. And with that, I will turn it over to Emily and Hanna to kick off the conversation.
Hello, everyone. Well, I'll start because I'm going to be asking Hanna some questions. So I'm really pleased to be here today because Hanna, I loved your book. I thought it was really fantastic. And I wondered if you could start us off by briefly talking us through the process of shoddy making.
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. And Emily, thank you so much for being here yourself. I just loved your book. I thought it was really spectacular, and I'm so glad to be here with you today. Talking a little bit about like the kind of basics of shoddy making. So shoddy is, generally speaking, is ground up old clothing or ground up kind of old rags, generally kind of shredded and then combined with usually a little bit of new wool, and then kind of spun together into new cloth. And I'm just gonna actually show, okay. Actually, Carrie, could you enable screen sharing?
It should be enabled for you. Let's see.
For some reason.
Try it again.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so can you see, let's see. So in some ways, when I think about shoddy, I like to think about the technology of shoddy, which kind of came into being in the late 19th century. And it's really like epitomized by the idea of a kind of like grinding or shredding machine, which initially would have been used to shred up kind of tailor's clippings and leftovers, along with collected rags, collected old clothes, and then turned into a kind of fibrous material, like what you can see in the top image, which eventually would be kind of spun into new thread and made into fabric, made into different kinds of fabric.
I don't think we can
like
see your screen, Hanna. Sorry to interrupt. We can't see your screen.
You can't see the screen?
No. You want to try again to choose the window? Did we lose Hanna? Oh dear. We'll have to imagine what shoddy looks like for a couple of minutes.
There are pictures of it on the cover of the book, aren't there? So, and it's sort of
That's right.
so we can get a sense of what it looks like when it's a sort of mashed up material.
Hopefully we will reconnect with Hanna here in a second. Maybe. Let me go ahead and I will put the buy the book link in the chat here. Well, Emily, while we're waiting for Hanna, do you want to talk about maybe your sort of favorite parts of the book and what you found most interesting?
Yeah, I might end up stealing Hannah's thunder later. I think for me, because I'd come across things like so at the end of the book in her act 3, because she explores shoddy in 3 acts. She puts in buttons that were part of the process. They were shodded as part of the process, and then they end up in the soils of Yorkshire. And it's something pretty mesmerizing about having something totally tactile from the time that, you know, would have been part of the old clothing and then went through this process of shoddy making. So what happens with shoddy is you sort of strip the stuff apart and then shred it all up and then remake the material. But in doing that, you take out things like the buttons and the studs and all the parts like that. But sometimes shoddy making wasn't done very well and they were left in the process. And so they end up in these sort of manure heaps. And so Hannah's got some pictures of some of these sort of bitten and nibbled buttons. And there's something really very, you know, it's very tangible about the past, that this was old clothing that was going to be made into new clothing, and there's still some remnants that get left behind. So I thought, because I'd come across these buttons before, but I thought there were very few of them, but I had a sense from Hannah's book that there's just like loads of these things in the fields in Batley, where they grow the rhubarb. So I thought that was all magnificent. But also lots of the images in the book are really very extraordinary.
That's just, I'm trying to picture this field full of buttons. It's fascinating.
Brass buttons. So there's a picture of them in the book, and they're really pretty magnificent. I'd love to see a whole exhibition just of detritus left behind by the shoddy making process.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Let's see. I'm a little worried that we still haven't seen Hanna pop back up. Well, is there anyone else here who has read the book who wants to kind of share their impressions while we're kind of waiting for Hanna? I heard by chance there might be folks from some of the shoddy towns discussed in the book in attendance. Is that actually the case? Feel free to unmute yourselves.
Well, I can say something. I'm unmuted.
Yes, go for it, please.
Just that I think that one of the things that makes this book so timely is that towards the end, it deals with the whole question of epidemics, pandemics, and the connection that arose between shoddy and disease. And she obviously was writing this, I'm assuming she was writing this before this last spring, but
definitely.
It gets into whole debates about where does this come from? Is it a miasma? Is it just something floating in the air that's bad vibes basically, or are there particular microscopic organisms that are responsible? And just the impact of people being afraid of disease and pandemics and looking to shoddy as they should have looked to shoddy as one of the possible conveyors of disease. So in the moment that we're in, it just tied it together beautifully, I thought.
Yeah, there were riots when they unveiled the shoddy bales, and people would be outed in the newspapers. You know, these are the people who bought these shoddy consignments, because there was these fears that they would spread disease. So, and this is where we are now, isn't it? Environmentally friendly or might spread disease. There's this clash of pandemic and climate change. And we get sort of hints that this is something that's not new. It's something from the second part of the 19th century onwards.
See, we have a comment from Wendy who says that she too would love to see an exhibition of all the stuff that's left behind. Wendy apparently lives in Yorkshire, close to the parts where shoddy was made. I too would like to know where this shoddy heap that is discussed in the book. Oh, look, I think we're getting Hannah back. Hanna. Let's see, there she is.
Hi.
Welcome back, Hanna.
I'm back. I got the router went all crazy. I'm so sorry. I got like kicked off the whole internet.
No, that's
It was
okay.
a disaster. I'm so glad. Are people still here?
People are here. Yes,
people are here. Okay. All right. Excellent. Great. Well, thank you so much for waiting, and I'm so glad I could get back in. It was kind of a mess. Okay. Okay. Can folks see a screen now?
Yes, it's working now.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm just gonna go back. I'm gonna try to like speed through the answer to that question, just so that like we can keep going a little bit. So the way I kind of understand shoddy is as referring to like the kind of grinding up of old fabric, old things that are worn, and the basically like being able to renew them by shredding, getting them down to the kind of fibrous level where they can be respun and turned into new things. And initially, like in the history of shoddy, and as many people still kind of think about shoddy, it was specifically and always wool, and it was kind of old wool and rags were getting shredded up. And then that would be blended with little bits and pieces of new wool fibers. And what would be produced would be kind of new or a kind of old new regenerated wool fabric, like the kind of army fabric that we can see here. But one thing that I want to kind of say that is kind of important for my project and like my vision for shoddy is that even once like shoddy stops being made just of wool, and now that we're in a much more like synthetically kind of driven world, my understanding of shoddy is actually as something that kind of continues. So even though it has this like origin in woolen shoddy, that still here we can see kind of in these images on the left, the kind of production of fibrous material from synthetic, modern day clothes that are mostly like cotton and nylon. And I see that as being part of the kind of process of shoddy making. So that's my quickie there.
So I researched shoddy a little bit for RUMMAGE, nowhere near as much as you did for your book. but I found that it had quite a lot in common with other reuse industries. And most significantly, that a lot of the legwork of the manufacture was undertaken by women. And also that in many of these reuse and recycling industries, there were respiratory problems created by the sort of small particles that are thrown up. So did researching the shoddy process make you angry at all about the plight of the people, mainly women, who were involved in the process?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I have to admit that since, you know, in Colorado and California and like all over the United States, since there's just been so much more pollution in the air as a result of these fires, certainly I've been thinking a lot more about the issue of like respiratory issues in, you know, inside and outside spaces. I was really interested in like looking at the history of shoddy in all of the kinds of diseases that ended up, you know, being carried both by like rags themselves, but also like in these shoddy factories where there was so much like dust being produced. And, you know, I was also really struck by, there were these like wool growers fever, shoddy fever, the way in which like conversation and thinking about those diseases became so connected with the way people thought about the fabrics themselves. And I have like angry, I have felt angry, but honestly, one of the ways I first came to thinking about like the work of the shoddy manufacture was actually in like talking to people who had worked in shoddy manufacture, who worked in like sorting and you know, worked with secondhand clothing in general in this kind of like tactile way. And the people I spoke to often had a lot of like pathos and sadness because of jobs that had been lost, because there had actually been something about this work that they no longer had. And so I think like maybe my sense of sadness and worry over like respiratory disease and this particularly women's work is kind of balanced by, I don't want to say like nostalgia, but also a kind of like respect or acknowledgement of the kind of interesting nature of the work and of the fact that it was work, and it's work that doesn't necessarily, you know, exist anymore for a lot of people.
And in addition to respiratory problems, were there any problems with eyes?
Yes, there's eye disease. People would get like a kind of ocular herpes sometimes, and which was thought to be carried in kind of wool fibers or carried in you know, in it was like a herpes kind of virus that would be carried into people's eyes. And so there would be eye problems based both on dust and dust and particulates, and then also the kind of eye problems that are like endemic to people that work in like the tailoring and sewing industries generally, to do with just this like really fine labor, fine work, fine machining, which then, you know, one doesn't have the gift of being able to retire, so one has to like keep doing it even when, you know, you can hardly see.
I'm going to read a little bit out from the book now. So the shoddy industry continued to be a focal point in varied political debates for decades to come. Shoddy was not only used as a metaphor for corruption and political oppression, but it was also praised and romanticized, both as a bridge between divisions in social and economic class, and as a symbol of scientific progress and related improvements in the general well-being in society. Now, what I wanted to sort of ask you is whether you could talk us through the etymology of shoddy. So both as a wool product that, you know, we've seen in the cover of the book and the images there, but also as this sense of something that's an inferior product.
Sure. Yeah, so a lot of people that come to the book and come to the project come with this association or this understanding of the word shoddy as meaning like shoddy manufacture, shoddy work, shoddy construction, this kind of adjectival meaning that it has now. Originally though, as a word, it emerges in the early 19th century to refer to the kind of technological process that, like I touched on before. And at that point, I mean, it kind of comes into being as a word around 1811. And there are like competing explanations for where that word comes from. So on the one hand, There is the idea that shoddy, the word comes from a kind of Yorkshireism, kind of a way of saying should go, meaning, okay, this process seems interesting and it should work, like hopefully it'll work. It should, so that became kind of shoddy, or should do. Now that is like a pretty commonly held understanding of the etymology. There's even as far back as the late 19th century, there's a couple others. So there are other people that come and say that actually it's more like shoddy is related to the word for shed, you know, the way a sheep might shed. And then also a theory about a kind of Persian, Arabic, Farsi type word, meaning kind of a connected mass of interlocking things. And so, it remains a bit of a question where exactly the word came from. In terms of like this interesting kind of secondary kind of etymology, which is like the etymology of a kind of it's sort of the pathway by means of which the word turns into this like adjective we have now. That is definitely a really interesting one. I'm going to just actually show, I'm going to try to show kind of a picture by way of talking through that. Okay, let's see, can you see a picture here? Yes, okay, great. So I want to say, and this often kind of comes up, that shoddy isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's plenty of high quality shoddy, and there are many ways in which shoddy can be not shoddy. Shoddy can be a higher quality kind of material than virgin wool, depending on the quality of the material you're starting with and the quality of the sheep you're starting with. But one of the things that happened starting, several decades after shoddy had become a thing in the 19th century is that a lot of shoddy started being used to make Civil War uniforms in the American Civil War in the United States. And the shoddy ended up being really shoddy. So there were a lot of military contractors who started making really bad shoddy fabric, and not only just making the shoddy fabric, but actually like clothing their own army in it. And so this became kind of like really scandalous. And it was like really the age of lots of, I don't want to say like trashy newspaper stories, but there was just a lot. This became really thematized in the press about these kind of industrialists that were actually acting not in the best interests of the soldiers that were supposed to be on their own side. And then, so that was sort of the first time when shoddy became shoddy, and shoddy became used in the Civil War as part of all sorts of discourses: shoddy millionaire, shoddy work, shoddy bodies, all sorts of things. And then this association between shoddy and the adjective meaning shoddy became like really solidified a little later on in the early 20th century, when the new wool industry started getting like really worried about the shoddy business kind of taking over its markets. And so the new wool industry started to work really hard to try to show that, look, if you really look closely, the shoddy's really bad, the new wool's really good. And there started to be campaigns. You can see in this image, this is like a campaign in the US Congress from the mid 1920s, kind of encouraging people and the citizens and housewives of America to not buy shoddy. And at that point, actually, the word shoddy, referring to this material, kind of like faded away and started getting replaced by other words like regenerated wool or resurrection wool, or a set of other kinds of names. And the adjective shoddy had at that point really become the adjective that we know now.
Yeah, I mean, the book is full of all sorts of fascinating images which kind of talk to each other in really quite extraordinary ways. Piles of things, you sort of think, how can you make piles of things interesting? But you really do, they have these communications between each other. Can you tell us something about the heap of shoddy that you have a picture of that's along the M62, which is a motorway in the north of England? How long has that been there? What does it look like? What does it smell like?
Sure. So yeah, the book begins and kind of ends in this big heap of shoddy, which has been kind of like barreled up beside the M62, which is this big, important highway in northern England connecting a couple different cities. And it's this huge mound. I actually, I'm going to show a picture of it so people can kind of get a bit of a sense on it. Okay. Okay. Is it there? Yeah. Yeah. No, it's not there. No. Okay. I don't know why it's not there. Let me try that again.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So we can see this is like this giant mound of shoddy, which is running alongside the highway. And it's kind of weird that it's there. You wouldn't necessarily expect a giant heap of shoddy, as I've just defined it, to be there. It's been dumped there beside a rhubarb farm. And it's a sort of a combination in this case of waste from shoddy mills and kind of woolen waste from woolen mills. And it's been dumped. The intention is to fertilize the fields because of the high nitrogen content in the soil, or in the wool. It's really huge, actually. It's hard for me to like maybe describe it, but this particular heap was really quite big. I mean, like 2 stories. And I don't know exactly how long it had been there for. The man who took me to see it was named John Martin. And he's kind of a horticulturalist in West Yorkshire who was very interested in kind of visiting these various heaps, looking for unusual vegetation that grow around it. In terms of like the touch and the feel of it, I think, you know, the sort of smell and the touch and the feel and the sort of scale of it, you can see here. I mean, other people thought it was kind of gross when they look at shoddy, but obviously I'm into shoddy. And so I was like really happy to pick it up here. And, you know, it's like heavy and soft and wet. To me, like really exciting, but I think to other people, you know, obviously a little bit less so. John Martin, who's pictured here, who's this horticulturalist, he points out that it smells a lot like wet dogs. And as you walk around this particular heap, there is this like wet dog smell, but you'll notice like depending on what part of the heap you're at, it might smell more or less like wet dog. And so here you can see like a different angle of that same heap. And the part that's smelling like wet dogs, as you might imagine, is the part that's actually wool, you know, like the way a wool sweater smells like wet dogs when it gets wet. So you can see in here, like there's white at the top. So that's the real wet dog part of it. If you're down here, more where you can see this like gray laundry lint looking material, that stuff smells more like, it smells more just kind of like dust. It smells like if you go into like a dusty factory. It actually smells maybe a little bit too like the way the sky smelled like last week in Colorado. But you know, I mean, there's so many different, you can see in the bottom, there's so many different like parts and particulates in this heap of shoddy that there's just a range of different kinds of experiences to be had.
So what brought you to study shoddy? I mean, it's not really the sort of normal subject that people would come to. So how did you get here?
How did I get to shoddy? Well, shoddy just seems like the obvious place to go. I mean, you went to shoddy a little bit. I got to shoddy because initially I was, quite a long time ago now, maybe 15 years ago, I was working on a documentary film with a filmmaker named Vanessa Bertozzi, a very good friend of mine. And it was really in the process of making a film about secondhand clothing and the pieces of clothing and how they move between, you know, a person, the goodwill when they give it, and how it then ends up going to, you know, going to another country or, you know, living all these other lives. It was in the process of that I first came upon this idea of shoddy, which to me, I mean, I came upon it in like a newspaper article about World War I. And to me, it just like seemed totally magical. Like just the idea that not only that clothes, it wasn't just that clothes were going from one body to another body, but that the clothes were being worn and then like utterly transformed into like a, I don't know, like a fairy dust, but you know, a dust that's good and bad. And so I really wanted to come back to it. I didn't make it into that film, but I came back to it for this book project.
Yeah, so I mean, as you say, I look a little bit at shoddy for my work because I look at recycling much more generally. But I stopped my researches once the shoddy had left England. So it was really fascinating and quite delightful for me to see what happens to it when it gets to America. And I was really quite fascinated by shoddy blankets, often sent from the northeast of England to the slave states. So what would these blankets, so now we've seen the sort of the shoddy in its sort of dumped state, but what would the shoddy in its made state as blankets, what would that have felt like and smelled like when new, and how well did they keep? So can you tell us a little bit about how people use their senses to judge the fabric? So the haptic, tactile information and other sensory skills that were used to sort of judge it.
Sure, absolutely. Well, when I think about the haptic kind of sensory skills that are used, I think a lot about people's, people doing this with their hands. But I think about that happening not so much when it comes to, people wearing things, but the haptic quality that goes into, deciding when you're sorting rags, what to put into like the blend of shoddy that you're going to use. And I also think a lot about the great effort that was made when there was shoddy material to try to like feel it and decipher whether or not it was good shoddy or bad shoddy. In terms of like the blankets that you're specifically kind of talking about, in terms of these army blankets, I was gonna just do a little, just show you one other, just show something about that to try to give a sense. Let's see if, okay, is it there? Yeah, okay. So these blankets, in a way, the particular blankets that I'm talking about, these blankets that end up being kind of exported from either England or the northern United States to the south, actually end up feeling pretty bad. So by all accounts, and I think one of the reasons why during the American Civil War, shoddy starts to get this like really bad reputation is that it comes to feel really bad. And and the low quality of it comes because of the, the scratchy, holey nature of it. So you can see like the blanket on the top here, if you think about it, I mean, it's supposed to be this like wonderful army issued item with, the United States is on it, but it's actually incredibly scratchy and uncomfortable. And I think a lot of them, at least allegedly, were made with paper. So like maybe it wasn't even all actually wool shoddy. There might've been some like, ground up paper in there. So it was pretty uncomfortable. And, would allegedly fall to pieces in water. So in a way, at least the way that like a lot of 19th century descriptions describe shoddy blankets during the US Civil War, they don't actually sound like that different from the shoddy heap that I showed you. They sort of almost seem like they practically already kind of sunk down into that.
Yeah. I mean, thinking about, if we can move from this to there was something utterly mesmerizing in the book about the similarities between the piles of shoddy that you put in early on, and then later on you put in pictures of bodies on the battlefield with blankets on them, surrounded by blankets. And it really weirdly made me combine the sort of composting processes in my mind. And you note how some of the American Civil War battlefield images were staged, and I sort of hadn't even anticipated that. And so can you tell us something about these stagings, the positioning of the blankets in the pictures, in the shots, and how this adds to your notion that you develop at this point of shoddy as some sort of substitute skin, which was absolutely fascinating.
Sure, no, absolutely. I'm just gonna share another image, hopefully get us, that might make it easy to talk about. So I do talk at length in the book about kind of a set of photographs that are, at least in the kind of American historical, American studies context, really iconic and really, appear in lots of US history textbooks and are studied by historians of photography in America. And there are these photographs by a series of photographers of Gettysburg, of a number of different battles that then become these like signature items to sort of memorialize the death and the suffering of the war and all it was kind of lost and gained. And they're also just considered very significant in the history of photography generally. And you can see here, there's just a couple examples. One of the things that has been known for a while is that these photographs, like many 19th century photographs from this time, are like highly staged and choreographed. People went on to the battlefield after the battle's over. The photographer moves around the bodies, maybe like moves around a little bit the guns and all sorts of things, and then stages these photographs the next day. And one of the things I became very struck by was just the fact that when these photographs are like written about at the time, they're talked about in terms of like the flesh and the white flesh of the soldiers' bodies and everything. But that when you actually look at them, what you're really seeing is a whole lot of shoddy uniforms. Really, like the gist of what you're seeing is cloth, and it's this like these layers and layers of cloth upon cloth, and not just any cloth, but this cloth that had come to have this very like negative kind of reputation during the war. And so just the sort of way these are both staged and seem to highlight so much these textiles definitely got me thinking a lot about the relationship between shoddy cloth and the way that shoddy cloth itself is like blending previous outside layerings of people's skin, and how then that becomes layered over kind of these dead and hallowed bodies. And actually, just 2 days ago, I just wanted to add this. 2 days ago, Peter Anker, who's a colleague and friend of mine, who's an environmental historian and historian of science, he sent me this photograph that he had taken, that he took actually near where he works in New York City, which is like, a very intense photograph, but of, people that are currently homeless during the pandemic in New York City, sleeping on benches wrapped in shoddy blankets, in this kind of current form of shoddy, the shoddy blankets that are like our piano blankets. And, this image was just like so startling to me, startling in light of, the reality of the present that we're living in right now, but also insofar as it really seemed to trigger for me, like that same feeling of like the uncanny liveliness of the shoddy blankets from the Civil War photographs.
Mm. And also the similar way that they sort of, these people are crammed into spaces because they're designed to keep them off the benches, and their armrests in the middle. There's something really quite startling about it. So another very pertinent fear now in the current pandemic is contamination. Can you briefly tell us something about the fears surrounding shoddy in the 19th century and early 20th century, both the fear of the rags that made the shoddy and the fears also connected with the completed shoddy goods? And while you tell us that, could you talk a little bit about, this is shoddy as a wool, is an animal textile. So did the diseases at the time help to establish cotton as the sort of preeminent sterile cloth of the modern period?
Gosh, well, those are all really good. Good.
A lot there.
A lot there. Yeah, well, so one thing actually, so I've been thinking about contamination in textiles a lot recently, because so many people have been asking me and just thinking themselves about whether or not secondhand clothing or other people's clothing is safe in this current moment. So, will I get COVID if I go to Goodwill? Will I get COVID if I borrow somebody else's t-shirt? Will I get COVID if I do all of these things with textiles? And one of the things that's really interesting is how concerned people are about this, compared to levels of concern about metal or plastic and all of these other things on the one. So that's interesting. But then that the sort of particularity that in our current situation with COVID, actually textiles are not a particularly good fomite for disease, for coronavirus. And in fact, all of these other things that we associate with the sterile really are. So metal and plastic are a real problem. Textiles are not, and yet everyone has this like almost automatic fear of textiles, right? Because they feel so skinly. Now, in the 19th century, the situation was different because we were dealing with diseases that actually could travel much more easily on fabric. And so contamination and disease and the kind of association between disease and rags and shoddy was both very apparent, like in the kind of popular imagination, imagery, etc., but also like in reality. So there was a huge, interest in the 19th century in the very question of like whether and how rags transmitted. When old rags were being transported from, let's say, Holland or Japan to the United States to shoddy factories, there was a lot of questions like, do we have to worry about these rags coming in? Is bringing in these rags as dangerous as bringing in immigrants? Are they as likely to be, are they as likely to carry disease? Are they as likely to carry other kind of unwanted things? So there was a lot of, and then actually the kind of inquiry into these issues about whether rags were contaminated with disease really did end up kind of like factoring into a number of important discoveries in, germ theory. The issue of cotton is really interesting. I feel like you're right. I feel like what you're right. And certainly the feeling we have about cotton, cotton doesn't have like the smell and the association of wet wool and the kind of like stickiness of it. And I do think even during the Civil War, we start to see these kind of cotton bandages. And so I think that's a really interesting insight.
Mm, mm. You put up some images by Alice Austen in the book, and I hadn't encountered those before, and they were wonderful. Can you show us some of those? There was one in particular, I think it's your figure 318, and walk us through any of those. Do you have those to show us?
I do. I do have one to show you. Let's see. Okay. I'm always worried now. Is it there? Can you guys see it? Yes. Okay. Yeah, so this is a photograph by Alice Austen. Alice Austen is a really just an amazing woman, and from New York, a kind of social documentarian, photographer, just amazing woman. And one of the things she did was, document a lot of people going about their business, working various kinds of occupations in New York, particularly on the Lower East Side in New York. And in the Lower East Side in New York and in lots of cities, there was a kind of deep-seated association between immigrants, particularly like immigrants from certain parts of the world, and the secondhand and rag industries. And so this is a photograph from 1896 showing two kind of rag collectors. They're collecting rags for the shoddy. Well, actually, I think they're collecting rags and shoddy. And they're seated here and they're like taking a break. But one of the things that struck me so much about this photograph is the fact that they're sitting on this street, and there's the trolley tracks, but you see all of these posters for the kind of high consumer kind of capitalist moment that's coming into being in the United States. You see like the ketchup and all these different theatrical performances and all of this kind of like branding happening. And then there's this kind of interesting way in which the branding is all just like these flat signs, but you have these actual things that they're carrying and that have weight, and they're actual commodities, and yet they're kind of totally anonymous. They're this kind of like weird bags of shredded up stuff. And so I just found that like very kind of powerful and interesting as an image, but also as an idea that somehow like in the midst of this kind of like rapidly industrializing, expanding consumer culture world, that there's also this proliferation of amorphous, blobby stuff like these rag bags.
Yeah, and looking at the lost and strayed and stolen in the background as well. One thing we were talking about when you disappeared for a bit, when your router disappeared on you, is that often you find in these rhubarb fields in Yorkshire where shoddy was processed, you find these buttons that are bruised and bashed by the devil's teeth that chop up the material. And could you tell us something about those? Do you have an image of those, the one that you put in the book, and also about the unusual weeds that grow there because they come in on the rags, the
Sure.
seeds, the weeds?
Yeah, the buttons and the weeds are great.
Yeah.
There's I do like the buttons and the weeds. I am gonna show you. Okay. So as Emily brought up, there are these amazing buttons that
we can't see them.
You can't see them. Okay. That's so okay. Well, thank you for telling me. I'm going to try again because let me try this again. Thank you for hollering.
Yeah, we got them now.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, this is a picture. This just shows on the left side you can see these are some of my shoddy buttons that I've got, up in the corner. You can see on the left some of these buttons that like I've collected from shoddy heaps. But the way they find their way to these shoddy heaps is they end up caught in these swifts. So you can see in this other photograph here, it's a swift, so it's like part of the devil machine that grinds up the rags initially. And if you're grinding up rags, one of the things that's going to wear down your machine is when things like buttons get stuck in the machine, because the buttons aren't going to go through the shredding machine. And you can see in this little image here, so you can see there's like a little red button that's gotten kind of stuck. I don't know if you can you see it? Hopefully you can see it a little bit. Anyway, so what happens is buttons get kind of jammed up and in these devil machines, and they end up then as part of the waste from this shoddy making process that doesn't go into, making new shoddy fabric or making shoddy mattress padding. Instead, it goes into the level of shoddy waste that ends up on the fields. And one ends up with a really nice, if you're interested in that kind of thing, you can find all sorts of different kinds of buttons. You can see in these buttons that they've all been kind of smashed up where they've gone through and kind of gotten stuck in the machine. I'll just briefly talk about those weeds that Emily mentioned. One of I think at the beginning I talked really briefly about John Martin, who had initially brought me to the heap. And he's a horticulturalist who is part of a kind of group of now kind of like aging interested British amateur horticultural botanists, became really interested in the specific kinds of weeds that were brought in through seeds on the backs of kind of wool fleeces coming in from all over the world. And so one of the things that ends up on the shoddy heaps as part of the kind of detritus or leftovers of the shoddy process is the kind of the leftovers from wool fleeces. So wool fleeces get cleaned before they enter into the kind of like wool economy. And what ends up getting brushed off and entering into a kind of cycle of wool waste and shoddy waste are little bits of seeds and brush and thorns that would have been caught in the wool fleeces. And so it becomes kind of part of this shoddy story. And there's an interesting way in which people collect shoddy weeds or have collected shoddy weeds. And somehow there's like a real nostalgia in these weeds for people that are, well, for all of us, if we decide to go along with it. But there's a real nostalgia for a kind of moment in sort of the colonial moment, the moment when you have all of these different kinds of wool fleeces coming in to kind of help run the British textile economy. And now, of course, because the wool industry is kind of, definitely on its last, there isn't a huge wool industry anymore in Northern England. There's an extra kind of nostalgia for the now very hard to locate in the wild shoddy weeds. But this image shows some preserved shoddy weeds from a Batley collection.
So, I mean, the buttons are a sort of contaminant in the mechanical process, but can you tell us a little bit about another contaminant in the process? And that would be the synthetic fabrics that come in the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s onwards. how do they scupper the shoddy process? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So starting in like the 1940s, in the textile industry generally, all over the world, there's just this growth in synthetic fabric and synthetic materials. So there's like nylon and there's acrylics and there's all sorts of kind of a ballooning of this. And, you know, we see it now with just like there being sort of polyester plastic particulates spread all over the world in every entity, basically being this kind of dust that's released from all of our synthetic clothes. So for a number of people who study shoddy, and in particular, like people who, a lot of people feel that shoddy is no longer shoddy if it's not wool. If it's not this like animal organic material, then somehow it's no longer shoddy. It's no longer the shoddy industry. And certainly from the perspective of like this shoddy heap that we started out with, in terms of thinking about, you know, shoddy providing an actual fertilizer for the soil to like help rhubarb grow or to sort of compost into productive soil in that sense, certainly it is kind of the end of that. So thinking back to that, to the heap that I kind of started with, you know, a lot of what's there, ironically, is not actually going to do a very good job. It's not really going to serve as a very good fertilizer. Yeah, so you can see here, a lot of this stuff, this laundry lint stuff, some of it actually is kind of like dusty wool, but a lot of it is just kind of synthetic dust that will never biodegrade. And so to some extent, actually, the dumping of it becomes a kind of way to get rid of trash or a way to get rid of waste without having to like pay waste tax. So hence you can see the do not tip any more shoddy on this site. That's a sign that somebody's put up, not just because they don't need any more fertilizer that will actually fertilize, but what they really don't need is more and more of this synthetic quote unquote fertilizer that actually serves no function and really should have a waste tax levied on it. But I feel like, I guess, for me anyway, I mean, again, I was mentioning how for me, shoddy is maybe a slightly broader set of materials than just wool. For me, I feel like even now, even today, when we are living in a kind of synthetic world, there are these synthetic shoddies that get made all the time. You can see one on the left here. And on the right, you can see this kind of synthetic shoddy being used in Arizona. And it's being used as house insulation, right? And you also see synthetic shoddy being used in all sorts of other interesting kind of ways. So I feel like synthetic fibers they certainly don't close the loop in a way that you could make an argument about wool fibers is doing. But there is so much that they kind of, I think, offer to our thinking in all sorts of ways.
That's interesting, Hanna. I know that we're getting close to the hour and we got a little bit waylaid. So I want to have time for questions if anybody wants to ask anything. I know we've got a question here from Laura about how the shoddy machine relates to the cotton gin.
Yes. Thank you, Laura, for your question. How does the shoddy machine relate to the cotton gin? I think that's a really great question and a really great thought. I'd like to take that question in the direction of thinking about what the cotton gin means in a way, like what the kind of symbolism is of the cotton gin. The cotton gin has all of this kind of meaning in the United States, certainly, to do with industry, to do with technology, and also to do with kind of slavery and the slave economy that, ended up being so significant. I feel like the shoddy machine has a really interesting, I don't know, maybe almost like a dialectical relationship to the cotton gin, because in some ways it's like, it feels like it's like it's undoing in a way, but it's also its complement, I'd say. Honestly, it's a really good question that I probably want to think about a little more. But I love the idea of putting them next to each other and kind of setting them up beside each other.
I Are there any other questions out there that we want to answer?
Hey, Hannah.
Hi, hey, how are you?
Yeah, it's lovely to see you. I've got loads of questions. I haven't looked at your book yet, but just to come right up to the present, do you think the COVID situation is going to make people more aware of the burden of their waste clothes? So, for instance, there was a little local controversy I was involved in last night where some of the mums I know in London were annoyed that a local charity was politely refusing donations of baby clothes because they were overwhelmed. And the mums were shocked to discover that, you know, charities often have to reject 75% of the donations. And that, you know, there's been this very kind of comfortable feeling that a lot of people have had for a long time, that their old clothes can just magically be reused by needy people. And you know, my understanding of the huge kind of environmental burden of waste fabric, and also kind of social burden of people sorting this stuff. And suddenly there's been a kind of pause in the system. And I just wondered whether you thought people were going to get more consciousness of the destination of their cheap clothes at the moment.
I kind of hope they do. I think they will. I think they will in all sorts of interesting ways. I mean, one story I've been following is in Kenya. The nation of Kenya has been working for years, like for decades, to try to keep secondhand clothes from kind of just arriving on its shore and, you know, in a way providing inexpensive clothing, but also driving out any kind of like local textile manufacturer. And it's been almost impossible to stop this. The U.S. has put up all sorts of issues where there's just the secondhand recycling industry in the U.S. has a lot of clout and has been able to say, like, no, you won't. You will, you'll take this stuff. Otherwise, like, we're going to make sure that you don't get this aid you need or all these other things. And now there's been this really interesting pause where Kenya has taken this new line, which is like, actually, we're really worried that all these like leftover clothing that you're sending to us, right, that don't have any use in the United States, we're worried that they have COVID and that they're going to make us sick. And actually, that's become a way of like stopping that flood of clothes right now. And of course, the secondhand clothing industry in the U.S. the trade groups have been making a big point about it and being like, but it's not true. Really, you should be worried about metal and plastic. But in some ways, like just the sense of it has actually put a stop to things. And I think there is a sense that it might actually kind of hold up. So I think, yeah, I think that's really interesting what you say, and I think it might.
Thanks.
Anything else, or shall we close it out for the hour? This has been really fascinating. Thank you so much, Hanna and Emily, and thanks to all of you for attending this afternoon and learning more about Shoddy with all of us. This was really great, and thank you. And we will hope that if you haven't read the book yet, that you will reach out and find it at the Seminary Co-op or at your favorite bookstore. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank
Have a
you,
good
everybody.
afternoon.